Welcome. Today we're going to be exploring the world of architecture and answering the question, what style of architecture is used in Fontaine? As far as I've heard, Hoyvers has stated that they've used a combination of steampunk and French architecture in the design of Fontaine. We can definitely see this straight away when entering the region, by noticing the French-esque names of people, locations, and so on. Also, the scenery is greenish, and we can see lots of peaks, which is a nice reference to the renowned French Alps. However, let's get into the styles. Let's start off with steampunk. Steampunk is not only defined by its architecture, but also by its arts and daily lifestyle. It is inspired heavily by the Victorian era and mixed in with over-sophisticated mechanisms tied to the invention of the steam engine. This involves the widespread use of steam-powered primitive vehicles such as cars, trains, zeppelins, and balloons. A specific art style involving a lot of sketches, drawings of gears, mechanical parts, and science fiction realism. Usually colors are more subtle, darker, and brownish, beigeish than usual. Steampunk is also reflected in clothing. In fashion are blouses, corsets, bowler hats, gloves, coats, parasols, pocket watches, canes, and all of this is dictated by the abundance of innovative technology. All of these types of clothing would be very expensive and unattainable without machinery by simple dwellers. But what we're here for is the architecture, and the architecture in steampunk again correlates with the use of machinery. This leads to new materials becoming popular and being used in architecture, such as iron, copper, aluminium. And since this never-to-be period is inspired by the Victorian era, we can't get rid of our truly beloved cobble, stone, wood, and granite. Machinery also allows buildings on the interior and on the exterior to have more intricate designs. Not always symmetrical, however, we do have to remember that symmetry is appealing, and so more often than not these designs still remain kind of symmetrical. We have decorative trims, textured wall surfaces. Even though buildings are no more built out of wood, they still use wood on the interiors and sometimes on the facades. Mostly dark wood, and this is mainly to highlight nobility because darker shades of wood are considered to be more rare. However, this is not entirely true. Long story short, this has to do with some colonial pretext, but we won't get into that. Nonetheless, steampunk architecture, although being based on the Victorian era, it doesn't have a clear definition and usually combines a lot of styles used during that era. And mind you, that's over 1 century of architectural development. So this might include some neoclassicism, all the way up to rationalism, constructivism, and so on. This includes Romanesque, Neo-Gothic architecture, Queen Anne, Baroque, Haussmann, and a lot more. I'll get into these later. For the sake of integrity of this video, I'll focus on the most common attributes of steampunk for now. And those are tall windows, domes, ironworks, pipes, towers, steep roofs, arches, sculptures, and monuments. Now, does Fontaine have these? Yes, all of these attributes are present in current Fontaine, and in this case, Fontaine is truly a steampunk region. I guess, bravo Hoyverse, you nailed it. Now, the only thing that I'm missing is a vehicle or a steam train. I wonder where those are, but for some reason, Hoyverse refuses to add any wheeled means of transport to the game. This can actually be a theory. What if the people of Tevat haven't invented the wheel yet? Nonetheless, moving on to France.
Hi, say hi to AI. Have you ever wanted to learn more than just ChatGPT? Well, now you can. Students from Geneva University have compiled an interactive and informative course about the available AI tools on the market today. Fill out the free form through the link below to secure your spot.
Okay, with that out the way, let's now look at how strongly does Fontaine actually resemble France. For starters, we need to understand what type of architecture is French. For context, France is divided into separate regions and each one has its own unique style. Also, France has a very long history and therefore there are lots and lots of styles found all over the country. But in this video, I'm only going to touch on the most recognizable and the most well-known styles of French architecture. First off, Gothic styles. Okay, what is Gothic? This is one of the most recognizable styles in architecture, but what is it? Its common attributes are pointed arches, high ceilings, clear stories, flying buttresses, vaults, rose windows, tall spires, and towers. Typically, these are cathedrals, but of course not always. Sometimes these are castles, and usually what you'll see is that they're covered in intricate and very detailed tracery and ornate stone carvings. Besides that, a common feature of Gothic architecture are grotesque and gargoyle statuettes scattered all across the exterior of the building. This gives Gothic buildings this stereotypical ominous and spooky vibe. Gothic architecture was very popular in France during the 11th to 15th century and was revived in the form of Neo-Gothicism during the 19th century. However, it never caught on to the masses. Going forward, we have the Baroque style. Just to keep it simple, Baroque style buildings are the ones that use beige stone for walls, and the roofs stand out and are usually a dark grayish tone. There are two things that are typical for Baroque. First of all, the use of curvilinear forms. Baroque embraces undulating shapes, or simply curves and straight lines with smooth transitions. Secondly, Baroque uses corps de logis. This is a layout of a building where there is a main building and two buildings next to it, acting as supportive buildings, so to say. This is where guest bedrooms can be located. Often kitchen and storage units are placed here. Most times these annexes are connected to the main building. However, this isn't always the case. This architectural style was popular in France during the late 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, and was used all throughout the 19th century and even in the first half of the 20th century. And one of the last architectural styles I want to mention in this video is Beaux-Arts. Beaux-Arts is influenced by Roman and Greek architecture and includes lots of arcades and colonnades. These buildings usually have tall windows, built on a large scale. Sometimes they even seem way too large. They're symmetrical and their roofs are distinctive and often include a dome or a series of cupolas. Gothic style. Nothing really resembles Gothic style in Genshin. Like the flying buttresses and the rose windows are clearly the most important attribute of Gothicism, not to mention the gargoyle and grotesque statues that are most definitely absent from Fontaine. Now, I can definitely see some hints of Baroque scattered here and there, the curvy forms and such. Some of the building's color schemes and layouts are definitely akin to those that are present in Baroque architecture. However, I do strongly feel that when it came to developing Fontaine's architecture, the designers at Hoyver's leaned into Beaux-Arts mostly. I do find this peculiarly strange, since Beaux-Arts isn't a very prominent style found across France. But as a style, it definitely has its own right to represent France's architecture to some degree of accuracy. Palais Mermonia, Opera Epiclese basically have all of the characteristics of Beaux-Arts. These include the domes, the scale, and of course a hint of colonnades or pseudo-columns. Now, the standard buildings in France where citizens live are different from the rest of the world. And this is interesting. In the northern parts of France, you can definitely find a lot of half-timbered houses. These are definitely very popular and inspired by German architecture, and indeed can be found even in abundance in southern parts of France. So yeah. Paris and major cities usually have lots of houseman buildings. These are 5-7-story stone facade buildings with tall windows, wrought ironworks, balconies, and the key distinguishable characteristic is the 45-degree slanted zinc mansard roof, which can be up to even 3 stories high. However, this is quite rare, and most often than not, you'll see a 2-story high houseman roof. Chimneys, lots of chimneys can be found on top of these mansard roofs, and sometimes there are towers and extensions, but this isn't a common trait. In the back of these houses, you can often find well-shaped courtyards and jardins. Something notable about houseman buildings is that they are usually attached to one another, and also they are typically located on straight boulevards and lanes. This is one of the reasons why they look so uniform and vary little from one another. Now, another thing I want to add about French architecture is that most residential buildings I've seen, I'd even go as far as to say 99% in some areas of France, have shutters, usually built-in shutters. Now, besides that, pergolas are also very common in southern France, and buildings being covered in vines or other plants. Now, is Fontainian architecture close to it? In my opinion, no. Houseman, a style so iconic for France, however, not really found across Fontaine. And sure, it would be dumb to assume that the designers would just straight up copy and paste real life architecture into an anime gacha game, right? Even though that would be the easier thing to do. However, to give Coreverse some credit, I do appreciate that they put in so much effort in designing the Fontaine's architecture from the ground up, and I do see how some people might find similarities between the residential buildings of Fontaine and Houseman, but for me personally, I can't lie, these buildings look like they're from a dystopian English fairy tale. Now about the shutter situation and the pergolas, yeah, that's a miss. Without them, I can't really argue that this architecture is French at all. As one French might put it, feu. Now, finally, let's fill out our mini rating list for Fontaine's architecture. Starting up with steampunk. Yes. 9 out of 10. Nailed it. Secondly, is French architecture reflected in the government buildings and other buildings of importance? Most definitely, somewhat. I'd go as to say that this one is a mid rating, somewhere between a 6.5 and a 7 out of 10. Now, the residential part of Fontaine, honestly, not satisfied. Although the architecture does stick out to me, I wouldn't go as to say that this category deserves a rating higher than a 3 out of 10. Can't be always winners. That's what I all say. Anyway, thank you for joining me on this video on Fontaine's architecture and its analysis. Hope you had a great time, learned a few things or two, and if you have something else to say, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below.